Okay, so this is the practice test or kind of review for the Unit 5 portion of the final exam. Remember, there's 100 points from Unit 5 and 100 points that are comprehensive, so don't forget about that. So let's get into it. Number 1, rank the following from least inclusive to most inclusive. So least inclusive is the smallest group, most inclusive is the biggest group. So what's our smallest thing there? So organism is smallest, so that's least inclusive. There's only one of an organism. And then we have a population, which is a group of organisms in a particular area that are capable of interbreeding. And then when we have multiple populations, we have a community. And then from there we have, when we include the living things and non-living things, we get the ecosystem. 2, which of the following descriptions about the organization of an ecosystem is correct? Communities make up species which make up populations. Populations make up species which make up communities. Species make up communities which make up populations, or species make up populations which make up communities. D, but honestly I think that's a terrible way to ask that question. We have described the effect of bodies of water on climate. So for that one, large bodies of water tend to have a more moderate climate around them, or they help maintain temperature. Or reduce temperature fluctuations, let's say that. Help reduce temperature. What is adiabatic cooling? So is that the rain shadow on the leeward side of the mountain, the cool daytime breezes in coastal areas, increased heat loss due to evaporation, heat loss due to convection, or temperature drop as elevation rises? 4 is E, temperature drop as elevation rises. Number 5, Drury-Mincy Conservation Area is in southern Taney County, southeast of Branson off of Route J. What type of biome do you think this best fits into? Is it a tropical forest? No. Probably have a lot more tourists in Branson if they had a tropical forest there. Is it a desert? Probably not. Temperate deciduous forest? What does deciduous mean? That means the trees lose their leaves. Is that what happens in Branson? Or even just Springfield, right? Yes, absolutely. So this is a temperate deciduous forest. Tundra, what's a tundra like? Cold, snowy, permafrost, right? Taiga is a coniferous forest there, in case you're wondering what those ones are. Number 6, the highly productive aquatic biomes where rivers meet the ocean with mixed salinity are known as... Which of those? That would be estuaries where they have mixed salinity. Which of these are biotic factors that limit the distribution of species? Does temperature limit distribution of species? Yeah, but is temperature biotic? Temperature is abiotic. What's biotic mean? Living. So temperature, that's not alive. Is water and oxygen alive? No. Competition, does that come from living things? Absolutely. So let's highlight that one. Sunlight, rocks, and soil, those are all abiotic factors as well. So the only biotic factor that limits species distribution is competition in this list. The rest of those do limit distribution, but they're all abiotic. So number 8 then, to determine the density of a rabbit population, you would need to know the number of rabbits and the factors that limit population growth for that rabbit population, the growth rate of the population, their pattern of dispersion, their birth rate, or the size of the area in which they live. To get density, we need to know critters per unit area, so E is our answer for 8. What technique could be used to determine the density of small burrowing mammals? A line transect, I suppose, potentially if you happen to catch their burrows. A mist net, are we going to net things that are burrowing? Probably not as easily. Mist net would be like to catch flying mammals or birds. Quadrant, well, if they move, they won't get caught in the quadrant, so that wouldn't be a good one. But live trap with mark and recapture would be a good one for determining the density of small burrowing mammals. The picture to the right, what kind of population dispersion do we see? I would call that uniform. They're pretty evenly spaced there. In the picture here, which organism has a type 1 survivorship curve? Well, we start at the top, we go 1, 2, 3 to the bottom. So C, the human, has a type 1 curve. 12, what factors lead to an increased population size? Well, how do we get more critters in a population? How can we add things? They can be born, right? So birth, and then what is the immigration where things come in? That would be with the I. So birth and immigration. And what factors decrease population size? Well, what's the opposite of birth? Like death, right? And then immigration with a E for exiting. Ooh. Something happened. Okay, sorry. I'm going to pause and fix this. All right, so 14, what growth pattern, logistic or exponential, is exhibited by these populations? So we said logistic is like kind of an S-shaped curve and exponential is like a J-shaped curve. So these are going to be showing logistic growth here. So they all kind of level off at that point there. What is that point where they level off called? That's the carrying capacity. Density-dependent factors that regulate population growth tend to be blank, while density-independent factors tend to be blank. On a test, I would not just have it be a blank that you have to fill in, but I don't know, it kind of keeps us alert here if we have to add some blanks in. So density-dependent factors tend to be biotic, right? Living factors, and then density-independent factors tend to be abiotic or non-living. So like a biotic factor would be like predation or pathogens, right? Abiotic factor would be like a flood or a hurricane or a fire, something like that. Drought. 16. Predator-prey, parasite-host relationships are classically considered to be what? It's good for the predator or good for the parasite and bad for the host, so that would be a positive negative. The competitive exclusion principle implies that coexisting species cannot use the same resources, coexisting species cannot eat exactly the same thing, coexisting species cannot have identical ecological interactions, coexisting species cannot be exactly the same size, or coexisting species cannot be closely related to each other. Well, that one's kind of tricky. Remember, the competitive exclusion was saying that two species can't make their living the exact same way because one of them will outcompete the other. So the best one for this is C. They can't have the same or identical ecological interactions. Resource partitioning. Can it result in character displacement? What's character displacement? That was the thing where we have the finches on, if they were living on the same island, one species would have a smaller beak, one would have a larger beak, but if they were on different islands, their average beak size was roughly the same. So can resource partitioning result in character displacement? Yes, it can. Can it allow different species to coexist in the same habitat? Yes, it can. Can it reduce competition? Yes, it can. Fortunately, D is a all of the above, so we're good there. So then, describe the following morphological and physiological defensive adaptations. So what's cryptic coloration? That's just camouflage. So organisms blend into their environment. I'm going to sneeze pause. So then aposematic coloration, that is that warning coloration. And then Bayesian mimicry, that is when you're a non-harmful species or a non-distasteful species, but you look like a harmful or distasteful species. So one species mimics a harmful or distasteful species. 20, when animals have conspicuous patterns and coloration that advertise that they should be avoided. This is an example of aposematic coloration. A flea is an example of a endoparasite, ectoparasite, brood parasite, or commensalism. Well, I got tired. Commensalism isn't even the answer here, right? Because a flea is obviously a type of parasite. So endo means inside. So is a flea inside your body? Fortunately, no. It's a ectoparasite. What's a brood parasite again? That's where one species convinces another species some way to take care of their young. So number 22, which habitat would have greater species diversity? Habitat 1 has 10 of species A, 10 of species B, and 10 of species C. Habitat 2 has 1 of species A, 1 of species B, and 28 of species C. So I think it's pretty obvious there. Habitat 1 would have greater species diversity because diversity is species richness and distribution. So that's what's going on there. 23, higher levels of diversity should accompany A, a low frequency of disturbance, B, a high frequency of disturbance, C, an intermediate frequency of disturbance, or D, high frequency of disturbance followed by low frequency. It's C, that intermediate frequency of disturbance, so intermediate disturbance hypotheses. 24, sea otters eat sea urchins and other invertebrates that graze on giant kelp. Without sea otters, these grazing animals can destroy kelp forests and consequently the wide variety or wide diversity of animals that depend upon kelp habitat for survival. When sea otter is present, kelp are abundant. This is an example of which of these? So sea otters, are they at the top or the bottom of the food chain in this instance? They're at the top. So this is top-down control. And then in the example above, sea otters, are they the dominant species, keystone species, ecosystem engineers, or not enough information? They are the keystone species. Remember, that's named for that little piece in the arch where if that piece is not present, the whole arch falls over. So with the sea otter, if the sea otter is gone, then that whole community kind of crumples. What's a dominant species? That's the species that is the most numerous. And then an ecosystem engineer, that is a species that's like literally physically changing the environment. I think beaver is the easiest example to think of with an ecosystem engineer because they're literally building dams and changing the way water flows. 26, the type of succession that occurs on abandoned farmland is, so really the only actual types of succession are primary succession and secondary succession. So we can get rid of B and D on this one. What's the difference between primary succession and secondary succession? Secondary succession, you already have soil. Do you have soil on abandoned farmland? Absolutely. So secondary succession, C is our answer for that. Primary succession, the soil has to be built, so you're starting on rock with primary succession. 27, based on the latitudinal gradient of terrestrial species richness, where would you expect to see the highest species richness? At the equator, right? Where's the lowest species richness? Oh no. The lowest species richness is at the poles. So 28, true or false, conservation of energy and conservation of mass apply to ecosystems? Yeah, absolutely. We can't just break those laws of nature. 29, this is a poorly worded question, but what flows in an ecosystem and what cycles in an ecosystem? So energy flows, right? Because where's energy coming from? For the most part, it's coming from the sun and then into our producers and then primary consumers, secondary consumers, so on and so forth, right? And then we say nutrients, or you could say chemicals, are going to cycle in ecosystems. So then 30, net primary productivity is the gross primary productivity less that which is consumed by herbivores, that which is consumed by the producer in metabolism, secondary productivity, or loss due to mortality. So what's your net? That's your take home. What's your gross, right? That's all you made. So net primary productivity is gross primary productivity minus the part that's consumed by the producer in their metabolism. Oh, and what's primary productivity in general? That's talking about the productivity of the plants themselves, the producers. The accumulation of herbivore biomass in an ecosystem is an example of, it's not biogeochemical cycles, that's a lie. What's transpiration? Transpiration is water loss from plant body surfaces. That doesn't have, I mean, it kind of has a little to do with accumulation of herbivore biomass, but not specifically, right? Net primary productivity. What's primary productivity again? That is having to do with biomass accumulated by the plants. So it's not going to be net or gross primary productivity. So get rid of that. So it's secondary productivity. So then 32, excess blank seems to play the biggest role in cultural eutrophication. What is cultural eutrophication? That's when we have eutrophication due to excess nutrient. Well, eutrophication in general is due to excess nutrients, but cultural means humans are the reason those excess nutrients are there. So phosphorus seems to play the biggest role in that. Oh, and that should be R-O-L-E, not R-O-L-L for roll there. 33, blank are autotrophic organisms with the ability to carry on photosynthesis and to make food for themselves. So herbivores, no. Carnivores, no. Omnivores, no. Producers, absolutely. So 33 is D. 34, less energy is available at each successive trophic level of the pyramid of energy because only a fraction of the available food is captured by the next trophic level. Some of the food that is eaten cannot be digested, or only a portion of the food that is digested becomes part of an organism's body, or all of those. All of those would be correct there. 35, give an example of a biogeochemical cycle and describe how humans have altered that cycle. I think kind of the most obvious one here would be the carbon cycle, but you could pick any of the other cycles. And this is kind of a good question to have a handle on there. So carbon cycle, and how have humans altered that? Well, burning fossil fuels is an obvious example of how humans have altered the carbon cycle. 36, blank is the use of living organisms to detoxify ecosystems, and blank uses organisms to add essential minerals to a degraded ecosystem. For example, nitrogen fixing plants can increase the available nitrogen in the soil. So bioremediation is our first blank, and then bioaugmentation is our second blank. So then 37, why is genetic diversity within a population important? So the population is less susceptible to a disease. Sure, right? Maybe some members of the population will get very ill and not survive the particular disease, but if we have more genetic diversity, then that increases the likelihood that at least something in that population would be able to survive. B, so individuals of the population can survive when the environment changes. Again, same idea there, like if the environment changes, hopefully at least some of the organisms in that environment or in that population would be able to survive the changes. C, so museums have more realistic collections. I mean, that's just nonsense. C is definitely not it. So it's going to be D in this case, both A and B. 2 human-induced threats to biodiversity. There's a number of them. You could come up with lots of them, but we could say, well, first of all, what's biodiversity? That's really like diversity of life, right? But we could say overharvesting, right? You could say pollution. You could say, I mean, that's 2. You could say habitat loss and degradation, or habitat loss, right? We could kind of go on and on here, but those are big 3. You could say climate change if you wanted. Again, we could go on and on that one. If I give you a question like that, that should be like a give me question. You probably wouldn't even need to take our class to know like how can humans threaten biodiversity. You all did a project on invasive species. How did those invasive species get to an area, right? From humans typically, for the most part. Well, not even for the most part. Just that's how they got there. So So then 39, why is biodiversity valuable and desirable to humans? Again, you probably don't need to take the class to know this, but medicinal purposes, that's true. Agricultural diversity, that's true. Consumptive uses, like we can eat it, we can use it for building material, so on and so forth, that's true. So 39, D, all of those is correct. 40, the figure to the right illustrates a blank. So this figure, we have a small population, so we have inbreeding and random genetic drift. That gives us a loss of genetic variability. That causes a reduction in fitness. That causes a higher mortality rate and lower reproductive rate. And so we get a small population, and it just keeps going there. So is that a regional approach to conservation? No, it is not. Is it an extinction vortex? Absolutely it is. The rest of them are just made up. So 41 then, what is the term for the number of individuals that participate in producing the next generation in a population? That is your effective population size. Because if they're the only ones that are generating the next generation, that's effectively the size of your population. 42, small fragments of habitat often have different biotic and abiotic conditions than larger fragments. This is largely because smaller fragments have more what? If they had more species richness or more diversity, well, they wouldn't be a problem, but having small fragments of habitat is a problem. Small fragments of habitat are really different than the other ones, or than larger fragments of habitat, because they have more edges. And remember, the edges are not the same. So 42 is C. 43, biodiversity hotspots must contain at least 1,500 endemic vascular plant species. An endemic species is it prevalent over a whole country or the world? No. Is it restricted to a specific location? Yes, it's only found in that particular area. And I think this is our last one. It is. So 44, why does DDT magnify within food chains while some other chemicals do not? Is DDT more toxic than other chemicals? Is DDT stored in fat and not readily eliminated from the body? Is it now present in great quantities in most natural habitats, or is it all of those? It's actually B. It is stored in animal fat and not readily eliminated. So what do we call that when we have toxins getting more concentrated at higher levels within the food chain? That's called biomagnification. Oh no. Or biological magnification. So they kind of gave it away in the question because they said DDT magnifies. So, all right. Well, you made it through. That is kind of the review of the Unit 5 section of the final. Remember, the final is 100 points Unit 5 and 100 points that are comprehensive. So hope that helps.